Good afternoon, Luang Por Kap.
Good afternoon, Ajahn Sumedho.
Thank you for taking the time to do another Q&A. It's very much appreciated. So today is Friday, the 13th of September, 2024. And today there was a topic I wanted to ask you to offer some of your perspectives on. I've been surprised in the course of the last few years how many people seem to be taken by surprise when their loved ones pass away, saying it was unexpected or it was a shock, and whether there's anything you can offer as a reflection for people to consider while their loved ones are still alive, but a way of kind of acknowledging the nature of bodies is to die, the nature of relationships are to end. How does one prepare oneself for that so that when eventually our loved ones do pass away, we're not completely bowled over by it?
Yeah. Well, being a monk, the whole monastic style is about reflecting on the way it is, rather than trying to become something or get something you don't have, but to see through the conditioning one has personally acquired through culture, through institutions, through education, through religion, to realize the human condition is like this. So it's pointing to oneself, one's own physical presence, as well as life itself as we experience through the senses. And so in monasteries, as you are well aware of, we reflect on all that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. And so for years, now over nearly 60 years, I've been meditating on all that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise. And of course, at my age, I've seen the passing of my parents, my sister, my teachers, and if I see it in a personal way, for example, 2.5 years ago, my sister died, and I still felt grief because that's common to the human condition. But I knew that was going to happen before she died. And so, people think that if you're really mindful, you don't feel any grief. Well, that's kind of an ideal position, but on reflecting on it, it's just natural. My sister was 91 years old, and she was not going to get younger or better, and she wanted to go. So even though on the news of her passing, I still felt a sense of loss because she was always we were very close. She was 2 years older than I am. So, and then when Luang Por died, it was interesting because he was quite incapacitated for 10 years, in which he could no longer speak, and he had to have 24-hour care, and he was disabled completely, had to be fed. And during those 10 years, I was here in England, and Ajahn Sumedho, the head monk of Wat Ananchad at the time, would phone me and said, well, it's a serious condition. He was taken to the hospital suddenly. So, this happened several times before he actually passed away. So when he did pass away, I was actually in Thailand at the time, and I heard he was dying. He was in a hospital in Ubon, and I rushed to the hospital, and they said, well, he wanted to die in his monastery, so an ambulance came to take him, and then I heard he passed away while on way back to Wat Nomapo. And even though this didn't surprise me, it didn't, I expected it, but I still felt the actual hearing that Luang Por Chah is dead is like this, and it's a grief feeling, but in Bhavana, meditation, you're aware of your feelings, and you're not trying to get rid of them, but to see their true nature as dependent on conditions. Like I was fully aware that he would pass away. In fact, it wasn't something I didn't want, because he was so disabled and incapacitated that I knew he wanted to, and when his stroke happened, he tried to stop the monks from feeding him, but the Sangha decided he was going to live, so as long as possible. So then I became the witness of grief rather than the griever. And of course it passes, and then you have the memory left, like Ajahn Chah's memory to this day is a very happy one. I think of him and I feel gratitude and love and that just his name, Luang Por Chah. But during my monastic life, I was about 31, 32 years old when I met Luang Por Chah, and these monastic reflections, which are quite profound actually. Remember when I first heard, all that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, will become separated from me. I felt that's really sad kind of reflection. Being an American, you're conditioned to want to be happy forevermore and live happily ever after. That kind of, even though you cynically you know better, the cultural conditioning is such that's kind of like death is not something you discuss in public. And I remember when publishing Mindfulness, Path to the Deathless, the publishers didn't want the word deathless. Even though it's deathless, they still said death is not something we want to print on the cover of a book. But it's a fact of life. And, you emotionally feel sad, but when wisdom is your refuge, then you realize that this is just the way it is. All that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will pass. And that's the natural condition. Phenomena is like this. And then in bhavana, in meditation, are you really a condition? Are you really the body? Is my sister really just a physical body? Was Ajahn Chah just a physical body that was born and died? And of course, in worldly condition, when somebody like Luang Por Chah dies, what kind of realm did he go to? So we talk about afterlife as if we know we might prefer one scenario to another. But my cultural background was based on if you've been good, you go to heaven. If you've been bad, you go to hell. So it was, the idea of goodness takes you to heaven, but if you screwed up in your life and you have to pay the price and suffer some kind of purgatory or hellish state. And that is just conditioning as a cultural, religious conditioning. Is that really true? Does that really happen? And I remember when Hitler committed suicide in 1945, we all assumed that he was in the lowest possible hell, and we actually wanted him to be there. I remember that. Just from my religious background, if anyone deserved eternal fire and brimstone and misery, it's Hitler. But then in the meditation, you realize, you begin to have insight, the fact that conditioned phenomena is about birth and death, beginning and ending, whether it's mental, emotional, intellectual, physical, what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, what we think. This is all phenomena that is created. It's not ultimate reality. It's not the deathless. So when the path to the deathless is the whole point of the Buddhist teaching, pointing to what doesn't die. When the body dies, what doesn't die? And my own insight has been in consciousness. So consciousness is the deathless. And sensory consciousness is all about birth and death, because like at my age, you have vision is going, eye consciousness is diminishing, and ear consciousness is limited now, and physical consciousness having trouble walking and moving around, so consciousness through the body, through the senses, is impermanent. But is that the deathless consciousness doesn't die? So then the insight is that consciousness is actually Dhamma, or they call it the Dhammakaya, the perfect state where things manifest, and anything that manifests has a beginning and an end, a birth and a death. And by just reflecting on that over and over, even though on an intellectual level you might understand it, but you still have the conditioning, personal conditioning that we have to deal with for the rest of our lives. So but instead of identifying with the consciousness through the senses, one's identity is with the pure consciousness, the deathless reality that's behind all the phenomena that we perceive, conceive, and feel through the body and the senses.
So thinking of how to prepare for the death of our loved ones is very much something that brings us back to look at our own mortality.
Well, it's preparing yourself for that is not kind of intellectual. It's just reflecting on life itself. as you experience it through your senses. So experience is sensual. To experience something, you have to, see, hear, smell, taste, touch, think, feel something with your emotions. And that's very dependent on conditions. Like just witnessing how praise you feel like this, and then you're criticizing, you feel like this. The conditions change. And one thing I found very helpful is, who am I kind of reflection. Am I do I have a soul, a kind of separate soul that is separate from you? And because that's how I was conditioned by religion in my initial Christian background. But in witnessing, which means the Buddha, there's a witness, it's the ability to realize the way it is, that all conditions are impermanent, and that there's no permanent separate self. And so this gives you the sense of freedom from the illusion that I'm a separate self, and when somebody dies, then they're separate, and they passed away. Where are they? Did they go to heaven, or are they just oblivion, or they're reincarnated? You could imagine anything, any scenario, whether it's like reincarnation or rebirth, but or just oblivion. But these are words that you imagine, and imagination is a sankhara. So is there a heaven and hell? And what you can know is that these words come and go in your consciousness through other conditions. I don't think of heaven in a kind of obsessive way. The word comes into my mind when the conditions are there for the word heaven or hell. It seems to arise. And people ask me at my age, will I be reborn again? And of course, that if I think of myself as a person, but I don't see myself as a person anymore. I see myself as Dhamma and the deathless. And that's not about birth and death anymore. And that's the way it is. But when I think of myself as a person, I lived long enough to see through all the illusions I have about being a separate person. So I don't hold to any illusions about myself as a separate person. But I still seem like a separate person. In terms of what's left of this life is, this is what you feel, and your body's getting old and getting ready to pass away. It's just the way it is, but it's not something I take personally, but see, it's just the natural condition of sankhara or phenomena. So that teaching all conditions are impermanent, I found very helpful to reflect on. And that's really what I teach, and encourage people to reflect on, rather than trying to become something. Like so many of us, when we encounter Buddhism, we want to get something. We want to become enlightened or become a bodhisattva or or get some kind of psychic powers, or we want to realize nirvana, and so because we're conditioned to think like that. So when I first encountered Buddhism, I had only the cultural background that I'd acquired over 30 years to deal with reading the scriptures, the suttas, or books on Buddhism. But then through the Bhatipada, or the practice of meditation, then which Luang Por emphasized over and over again, and encouraged and always pointed to the way it is rather than how everything should be. So, in my own experience in being the head monk of a monastery, I have an ideal monastery. Yeah, I can imagine an ideal monastery. But monasteries are not ideals. And they never will be. They'll never get an ideal Amaravati monks and nuns experience. Sometimes it seems perfect, but it will change. And so this is, one felt Luang Por was always ready for crises or difficulties or disrobings or monks going off the track and committing offenses. And he didn't ever seem surprised when things like that happened. Yet in the first year, I idolized the monastery. That's all I could do was he's the best teacher, this is the best monastery. But then through reflection, and as you live in a community, then you begin to become more critical. When I first encountered Ajahn Chah and Wat Mapong, I just, idolized it. That's what my habit was, to do that. And yet, it didn't take long before my critical faculty started seeing things I didn't like or approve of or didn't understand. But reflecting on the monasteries are phenomenal. They can't, you can't take phenomena to a permanent ideal position. It's just not its nature. So by reflecting on this again and again, over and over, you break through the cultural conditioning, the ego conditioning, to where the unconditioned is what you know. There's a realization. It's not an object that you can know intellectually, but it's a knowing through insight, through reflection, through meditation. And the Buddha's teaching is just direct pointers at that reality, at the deathless reality.
So there's not really, just coming back to contemplating loss of loved ones, you can't really consider that separately from just loss of anything at all. Impermanence, is that right?
No, because loving somebody else is a condition that we develop. It's very personal. But witnessing, mindfulness, is not personal. So that's what our refuge is, in Buddha rather than in our personal feelings. And Buddha is the mindfulness, is pure consciousness that knows Dhamma. All that is, all conditions are impermanent, and all Dhamma is not personal, not self. And at first, intellectually, we can understand that, but it's through bhavana, through meditation, that we begin to realize it for ourselves. And bhajatang veti dapo it's not something that you know completely for yourself. It's not a belief. It's not what you're supposed to think as a Buddhist or a meditator or anything like that. It's real as awaken to reality, but we still have the human condition to deal with, one's own karma. Like I still have to operate, and my karma is very personal. But I'm not that. I'm not the karma. So I can witness the vipaka karma as it arises. It's not that I don't have any, but I realize it's just when conditions change, this is what you feel.
So one last question. In reflecting, using reflections such as all things are impermanent, all that is mine, beloved, and pleasing will become otherwise, it's really pointing to things that we're attaching to and identifying with, and basically opening the door for us to realize this position of the witness. So would it be correct to say that when this realization occurs, then we can experience loss and grief in a different way because we're not identified with the relationships anymore. So when these things change, that's just an ending rather than a loss of ourselves and our own hearts or anything. Because our refuge is awareness, which you can't.
Well, trusting in awareness, you can deal with the grief. Where people that can do that, just, it takes a long time to get through it. And in Europe, for example, European culture, in the old days, they give the widow a year to recover, wearing black, and everybody knows she's a widow, and they're giving her space to grieve. And I remember many years ago, a Sri Lankan woman, kind of older woman, her husband passed away, and she was so grieving for him because they married at an early age, and he did all the financial dealing with the finances, with the paying of bills, with life, and she didn't ever have to do anything but just go along with what he took care of her so well. And here she finds herself without him in a world she doesn't know how to deal with and cope with. And she consulted with me, and a year later she came back. She has recovered. And at the time she was grieving, she said, my life is ruined, because that's how it seems. It just seems like it's the end of life, end of happiness. And that's that kind of thought is depressing. It makes you feel depressed, and people get caught in depression because one's life always has these experiences of life isn't worth living, and depression is a part of the human experience. But depression is impermanent and not personal. So when the vipaka arises, I see it as that. It's just we have these terms like vipaka karma or resultant karma. And seeing it in that perspective, then one doesn't grasp it. You feel it, but your relationship to it is being the Bhutto, the witness, as you feel it. And then like emotions last a long time. Where words, thoughts, or images come and go very quickly, but then especially that this is a feeling realm that we're experiencing. As you know very well, Ajahn, a human body is all about how it feels. And intellectually you can know that, you can know it's not personal, but when you're feeling pain or sadness or grief, it feels very personal. But this is where it's like taking a stand with awareness rather than with your feelings. And it's not suppressing the feeling. It's not denying or trying to, or take, people take drugs or alcohol in order to feel better because they're depressed. But that's just a very temporary and dangerous way of dealing with sadness, grief, or depression. But in Bhavana, then these are your teachers, what you learn from. They teach you, all that is mine, beloved and pleasing, will become otherwise, or all conditions are impermanent and not personal. And that's a big relief, not to feel like a separate person. Because to always feel personal about your life, taking things very personally, is torture. Because, like, you can see from your life, Ajahn, that you get praise and blame. And if you take it personally, you really suffer. But if you see it's teaching you that these are impersonal conditions arising and ceasing according to past actions, past education, cultural conditioning, ego development.
Well, thank you for these reflections, Luang Por. Very grateful.